YouTube. It's been a long time, YouTube. Some would some international. It's been a long time. This is Emunah Israel, Solonomics 101. It's been a long time, YouTube. Yep. So much going on, so much going on, so much going on. But I want to say a big shout out to all of those who have been here before and who are just joining me. I see I got a lot of subscribers. So shout out to all those who subscribe. Continue to click the subscribe and the share and the peaceful discussions. Um, some of the comments were off the chain. I've seen some, haven't been able to respond to some because, again, I was working on some stuff. But YouTube is always interesting. So this is Emunah back once again. There's a lot going on in the world today. Still, at the same time, nothing much has changed. So I am still here. Praise be to the Most High, and I'm still well. And today we're going to be talking about. Today we're going to be. At first, I was unsure what to talk about on my first day back on the YouTube streets, right, in this capacity. But I decided, hey, let me go ahead and jump right back in to a space that I see most often underserved. And this is a thought that I have had for some time now, and I shared it in other spaces, but I wanted to bring it up again because of the continued, it continues basically, what's the word I'm looking for here? Not understanding what happened, and by extension, not understanding what's happening. And so we have a lot of frustration. We have a lot of indifference. You have continued episodes that manifest themselves and still not understanding what is the root of it. And so the title I titled this was Slavery Was a Textbook Case of Domestic Violence. Slavery was a textbook case of a domestic violence, unraveling systemic racism. And for those who like to come on the channel and try to rush people along, this is a perfect surface announcement. Getting this information, gleaning this information, processing this information is not microwave. Hey, what's going on? It's not microwave. You can't expect to just push buttons. I know YouTube, tells you that they're going to download thousands of years of information in 2 seconds, but that's not me, right? And so if you're not able to bear with me as I share this information, feel free to skip through to wherever you find you're getting what you're looking for. But for those who are looking to get understanding and even go into their own spaces and be edified, then bear with me. So that's the thought that as I'm doing this research, although I did take a break because I was working on a business, and business is like a new little baby. So you have to put all your time, all your energy into working on it. But I have not forgotten this study. Okay, so domestic violence, I'm going to give a little information on domestic violence. And maybe if we switch the lens, maybe if we turn it around a little bit, then we can approach the situation with a little more understanding and less frustration. Although it is frustrating, what we're seeing in the streets are as a result of what has happened. But what I've noticed is because for lack of a better term, the oppressed and the oppressor still occupy the same space, then the narrative oftentimes is still told by or recorded by the one who was doing the oppressing. And so if the information is going to implicate that individual, if that information is going to make that individual to feel convicted in any way, then oftentimes what we get is forget about it. That was so long ago. Get over it. Why are you still talking about that? Da 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 da. And then we have those who have been offended and children of those who've been offended. Like, you still celebrate 4th of July, Independence. That was long ago. You still say never forget 9/11. That was long ago. You still say don't forget the Holocaust, which was long ago. There are many things that happens on the other side that happened a very long time ago, but the thought process is never, oh, forget about it. That was so long ago. There's still a Columbus Day, which happened a very long time ago. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Isn't that what it says? And that happened a long time ago, but Columbus has a day. And so we have this indifference to say, why is the narrative and story of the one that was wrong, why are they told to forget it? But those who are the conquerors, those who are the victors, get to celebrate their accomplishments. So if we just shift the lens a little bit and just leave slavery over here just for a second and turn your attentions to Domestic Violence Month, which, by the way, just passed in October, Domestic Violence Awareness. And as I was studying, and this has always been something of interest to me, and I'm looking at it side by side, I'm like, wow. So this is my theory. The transatlantic slave trade and the effects of the American and the America's plural institution of slavery was a textbook definition of domestic violence. Okay. And I'm going to give you my reasons why. But this is just the overview today. This is my introduction back. Shout out to everybody. Missed you guys. Still grinding, man. Still grinding. Okay. So domestic violence, right? Also known as domestic abuse or family violence, is violence or other abuse by one person against another in a domestic setting, such as in marriage or cohabitation. It may be termed intimate partner violence when committed by a spouse or partner in an intimate relationship against the other spouse or partner, and can take place in different type of basic relationships. And I'm reading right now from Wikipedia just for an overview. It goes on to say domestic violence can also involve violence against children, parents, or the elderly. It takes a number of forms, including physical, verbal, emotional, economic, religious, reproductive, and sexual abuse, which can range from subtle to coercive forms of marital rape to violent physical abuse, such as choking, beating, female genital mutilation, acid throwing, disfigurement, or death. I'm going to rewind because what I just read to you is the textbook definition of domestic violence. But in every one of those points, every single one of those points, this is, I'm going to really slowly, you will find what happened during slavery. So let me give the overview for those who may not be aware, or those who may have like the abbreviated version of what went down in slavery. And then I'm going to go back. Shalom, fam. Welcome to the discussion. Welcome back, everybody. Then I'm going to go back to what I just read. So in brief, you had some peoples, a number of people groups, because again, this is just a short overview. It wasn't one set of people. It was people groups on the continent that had some level of interpersonal or intertribal wars, which resulted when the European came over, there was already slavery. I'll say that before and I'll say it again. There was already slavery on the continent. Mostly people were kidnapped, prisoners of war, or sold for debt, okay? When the European entered into the discussion and to the conversation, you had kings and tribal leaders who went into agreement with them. To some decided to, hey, if I get my enemy out of here, I won't have to deal with him and I get a little compensation. There are different stories. There were some peoples who fought it and some who were compliant, but that's for another day. So on the continent, there was abuse, there was rape, there was stripping. Good evening. There was stripping of everything, essentially. Everything that happened on one side also happened on the other side, okay? There was kidnapping, all of that, okay? Once you got on the ship or out of the barracoons and onto the ship and to the Americas, you experienced, or your foreparents experienced the same tragedies they experienced on one side, they experienced on the other side. Now, I'm going to go back to domestic violence now. On this side of the water, now living with, because remember, first time in America and in the Americas, it was the what's the word I'm looking for? The businesses were within the homes. So the plantations were domestic businesses, right? Home-based businesses. That's what plantations were. Okay. And in these home-based businesses, they needed manpower and they employed without pay the labor of the captured individual, enslaved. So domestic violence says that you have violence against children. It's documented and well known that there was excessive violence against children. Parents is documented and well known that the parents felt as though that they were not really parents and could not parent their children because the slave master essentially was over everyone. And so if the slave master decided to take your child or sell your child or do whatever to your child, you really had no recourse. There's nothing you could have done. You were powerless. Okay? The elderly, it's also well documented, and we can go into those documents at another time, that the elderly oftentimes, after they reached a certain age and were not able to extract labor from them anymore that was beneficial, was sometimes just discarded and left to, wither away unless they had some type of way in which to sustain themselves. It takes a number of forms, it says. So physical, we already know that. That's what a lot of people identify with. The physical beatings, the whippings, the torture, things of this nature. Verbal, this is where the cursing you for your skin color, cursing you for the way you look, cursing you for your hair texture, cursing you because you're a slave, saying that you're an imbecile, and all of these things. So the way in which, because it was a forceful institution, that you were taken without consent, then they needed control mechanisms in which to control you. So therefore, we have these negative control mechanisms such as physical abuse. That's domestic violence. It happened in slavery. You have verbal abuse. You have beatings. We spoke about that. Female genital mutilation. And there's information about how doctors, so-called doctors, I lose the term loosely, would say that the woman does not feel pain, the melanated woman, so she doesn't need to, I forgot his name at this time, who did his gynecological exams on melanated women without any anesthesia, because he was the father of gynecology. What's his name? If somebody's in the spot right now and remember his name, feel free to share his name. I have to look it up and bring it back at another time. But this is just an overview. Economic, this is the one that we still struggle with. All of these we still struggle. And if you look at the melanated community as a whole, you will see the struggle with these things, even on to today. There was a sister on Facebook who asked a question about what's one of the most toxic terms that you, as a growing up in our community, that you heard. And some of what I read, I'm going to get it. I'm going to pull it up because I just saw this. Some of what I read was so disheartening. But this is the things that they remember being told, not 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but even onto this day. This is fresh in the memory. This is that verbal abuse that became a part of who we are, but it came from our experience. Economic, which is forcing somebody to work without payment. This is where we're hurt in this space of economics. We're hurt in trusting one another in economics. And as a whole, we're hurt in understanding really what economics is, because, we don't really have access to, as a whole, we don't have access to materials. We don't necessarily have access to things that are going to allow us to build ourselves economically. Religious is another one that people, that people are still captivated by, because the need or the desire for, again, this is control, the slave master to control the minds of the slaves, then they had to manipulate them religiously. Of course, reproductively, we know and understand that some women were enticed to have a multitude of children. And if they furnished 12 or 15 children for the master, the hope was that he would let her go, right? And so you have this reproductive exploitation. Some spaces you didn't have permission to marry or be with whom you wanted to marry. There was a thought that slaves couldn't even marry. And so you have this serial monogamy where you may breed with one person and then the slave master takes you there, sells you another place, or takes your mate, sell them another place, because they want to get the most strapping buck and the most strapping wench, their terms, not mine, to breed and reproduce strapping slaves, right? So far, it's exploitation in the physical, verbal, emotional, economic, religious, reproductive. Remember, I'm not reading about slavery right now. I'm reading about domestic violence. Sexual abuse, we already know. One of my favorite narratives to illustrate this is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, where she speaks about this sexual abuse. She speaks about this predatory type behavior. We see a lot of this in the news now about sexual harassment and predatory type behavior. But this was an institution where if your slave master, you couldn't testify against them in court because a slave could not testify against a European in court. So when Cecilia, her name, a slave called Cecilia, when she was being sexually abused, 15 years old, a young girl, and she couldn't take it no more. She bore, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2 children for her slave master, and she couldn't take it anymore, and she ended up taking his life. Actually, there's a case in the news right now. I just passed her name. There's a case in the news of a young girl who was kind of in a situation of being exploited sexually, and she stood up for herself, and they sent her to jail. And now I just read that she might be getting the case looked at. And excuse me, I don't remember her name right now. I have to go back and get that. But I just wanted to bring that up concerning sexual abuse. Again, it can range from subtle to coercive forms of marital rape and violent physical abuse, such as choking, beating, female genital mutilation, disfigurement. We know that the chopping off of the leg, the cutting of the hamstrings, the burning of the skin with hot irons, all of this type of behavior. So when we look at it, we step all the way back for a minute and step away from the lens, and we look at it through this, then we can understand the damage that has done and possibly use the course that has been laid out for identifying what types of abuse epigenetically we may still be dealing with and perpetuating upon one another, and thereby working our way to healing. This is how I'm reverse engineering the situation, right? Because for a long time, if you go all the way into it, and you're not able to, you miss me, I missed you too. I've been medical apartheid. I've been working on a business. I think the last video I had, I'm working on a business, and so it takes a lot of energy, and I was tired. It takes a lot of energy. So I've been here. I missed you guys as well. But I realized, what, Emunah, you got to come and speak to brothers and sisters here at YouTube and continue to share this information. And hopefully we'll continue to bring more information together to get an understanding. Because again, the situations that pop up are the same thing. It's just in a different form. And then we get upset, we get riled up, and then there's an argument against white, against black, and then they get riled up, and then it dies down, and then it bursts up again. And then and nothing is healing the matter. And it's possibly because we're looking for validation from those who have yet to accept their responsibility in the matter and the fact that it is still happening. And so when you ask the people, why are they mad? Why are you upset? Why are you angry? When you look at what's still happening, it's the same thing that initially was the problem that never got fixed, right? And so as I continue to, analyze what's happening in and around me and try to separate myself from it so that I can get an understanding. You read the book, you read one of the book, Medical Apartheid. That I think I have that book too. I don't think I finished reading that book. Feel free to share. I think, hold on. Let me see. No, I don't have that one. I think maybe that book is on my list. I wanted to check and see. Those are the type of books like medical. Those are the type of books. Can I share my library? That's what I was gonna say. Those are the type of books that I tend to read. I'm gonna tell you how I approach the way I study this particular issue. Is I take a look at the core narratives that were left on record. which is, and I haven't been able to make my way through them because it is so much. So they did a writer's project back in the early 1920s, 30s. It's called the Writers Project, where they catalog hundreds and thousands of narratives from those who were alive during slavery. So it's the last voices of those who were alive during slavery. So that's primary source material, right? And I use that primary source material to kind of take a look at the landscape. But they would have been children during slavery, and then they grew up post-slavery, right? So they interviewed them in their 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? And then I look at things such as domestic violence, things such as how do you heal, right? And so one of the parts of healing, the primary part is acknowledging. So you have to take a look at what's wrong. So I take a look at what already happened, and then I take a look at what is currently happening and how it's connected to what happened then. And also looking at epigenetics and understanding that these traumas can affect, you didn't even have to experience it. Your foreparents passed this down to you. And if you don't know, you are already programmed to experience or react or behave in the way that you are because you're predisposed to certain things. So some of the things, again, like I said, I read narratives. I'll share them as I go, but I don't have a medical. I thought I did, but I do have. I'll give you guys 2 books as it relates to, if we chop each and every one of these subjects down, it's a lot. So the more we tackle collectively, then we can come back to the table and be like, aha, I see this, this, and this. So as it relates to, let me go back to the list on the domestic violence side, and then I'll give you a few books that I have on that. So domestic violence, let's talk about reproductive and sexual abuse. So hold on one second. Let me get it again. All right, where did my other book go? Okay. All right, so like I said, it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot. My bad. I didn't plan to so we have slave breeding. I was listening to a program, and sometimes I don't get to read the whole book because I just, when I'm listening and I hear and I'm like, whoa, that's a piece, then I grab the book, and then as I go along, I read. So this was published University Press of Florida. This is Gregory D. Smithers, right? And this is called Slave Breeding, Sex, Violence, and Memory in African American History. That's the name of the book. And he speaks about, and actually I was listening to the interview, and he was like, they warned him not to write this book, don't dig this up, this, that, and the third. But this, again, looks into sex, violence, and the memory in African American history. And we just read about that being part of what could be classified as domestic violence, right? Because the case that we're going to make here, hopefully the case I'm making, is that when we look at it, we understand it, and we get the information, then we can see in what parts we are still affected today, and then we know what parts we need to address and work on and release ultimately this toxicity that has been trapped in our cells, in our very cell, in our very DNA. Another book, I've shared this a long time ago. This one I found very informative. This is More Than Chattel. This is another good one. More Than Chattel, Black Women and Slavery in the Americas. So this is not just in America, this is in the Americas. And they share about their experience, because depending on who the captor was, even though some similar experiences are shared, some of them vary, right? So if you talk about South America, if you talk about Brazil, which is one of the largest, if not the largest place that melanated people were collectively deposited in the Western Hemisphere, you will see a different, you would see this illness, like this toxicity, play out differently. This virus is what I want to say. right? You will see it played out differently. This human virus that has infected the soul, it plays out differently than it played out here in the Americas, than it played out in Jamaica, which is another place. And I learned that's where my foreparents were dropped off. And that's another place where I learned the makeup of those that they dropped in Jamaica tells a story, because Jamaica was a space where they put the refuge. Jamaica was a space where they put those who were didn't die down easily. They were not docile. So you see that the spirit of the island, as well as Hispaniola, which is Haiti, you will see the spirit of the people. That's because you had these very hot-tempered, hot-blooded people who refused to be downtrodden. They was like, yo, we ain't taking them for y'all to go spoil up the other slaves, so we're gonna drop y'all over here. And I actually came across some information that they would call them the Comoranti Negroes. And that was a space, that was a port in Ghana, if I'm not mistaken, that this is where this type of, like, I know I'm royalty and you're not going to kick me down type of information came from, right? But that's another story. I don't want it to get all the way off topic, right? If you have any questions or comments, feel free to share. This discussion we're having is slavery was a textbook case of domestic violence, unraveling systemic racism. And so the sad part, all of this is passed down from generation to generation in DNA, whether we went through it or not. This part is correct and true. But here's the hope. Here is the reality. Epigenetics can be turned around, right? You can reprogram memory. In the same way memory, you were traumatized and the cells still have the memory of what happened and it can be passed down. You also can flip it and it can be changed. But in order to flip it and for it to be changed, we have to be honest and come to terms with what has happened and how do we then turn it around in another generation. They say, how long does it take a generation or how long does it take a people to forget their culture? About one generation? We see that in those who've come to the Americas from all different countries. And if in that one generation, if that culture and that tradition and that memory, the social memory is not passed on, that next generation of children, the grandchildren, have totally forgotten. So it works both ways. But we have to, because our trauma went so deep, and I'm going to tell you the book that actually made me come to terms and to grips with this thought. I don't want to get up again, but the name of the book is Trauma Bonding. That's the name of the book. And that when was reading that book like few years ago, I'm like, well, wait a minute. And then the light bulb went off, right? The light bulb went off. So I'm gonna continue on this domestic violence because again, you have Domestic Violence Month, you have domestic violence awareness. You can call the police for domestic violence. One of the things with the domestic violence, like we saw, when the slave was personal property, they hired as what do you call them again? Slave catchers to retrieve personal property. So we know that the slave catcher position, when he was on horseback, mutated into the police position. So this hostility between police and the community had its very roots in slavery, as we're talking about the police and the melanated community. This is not to say that other communities do not have issue with police, but this adversarial relationship between the police and the melanated community goes back since slavery. There are accounts. Miss you too. I miss you too, Speaker Bill. Miss you all, man. I'm here. I'm gonna try to work it in, y'all. Now that you got the baby, my business. I got a business, and it was a hands-on business, and so it's a lot. But you got to keep sharing. The work must go on. There are some narratives and accounts, and I'll give you a little better insight in some of the things you will find. You'll find some really good gems. Osar said plantation police. Dr. Paul Anderson speaks on this in his new book, 101 Questions. Right, the plantation police, right? Even the badge kind of looked similar to the police badges now. And so the thought was the slave, understand, the slave was the enslaved individual, the body was private property. There was insurance on the slaves. Insurance. It's just like when you read about the Zong massacre. The Zong massacre. It happened when a ship was coming and they were supposed to be going to Jamaica, and and it didn't make it there. He came from the coast of Africa. You can look it up, Zong massacre, and it didn't make it there. And the captain decided to throw overboard those who were on the ship so that he can collect the insurance money, right? The insurance money. So when you look at that, you will see that slaves were insured. They were considered to be private property. People took out mortgages to purchase slaves. It wasn't at the time during slavery to purchase a body for work was not a small venture. So there was a lot of uh, impoverished Europeans who could not afford slaves. There's also known that there were melanated people who owned slaves. Like I said, on the continent, you had melanated people who owned slaves. So the thought came here that slavery was strictly white against black, which is also a social construct that's made up, right? But that's not the case. That's what it ultimately became. Back to domestic violence. Back to domestic violence. It's important for us to, and it's difficult, I'm not gonna lie. I'm talking after having processed it, but it's important to, and continuing to do so, to kind of step back and process what it is we're seeing and what it is we're hearing when we hear these terms, when we hear systemic racism, when we hear all of these things, so that we can kind of come to an understanding and hopefully help those around us and in our community. But I was going to go back to the plantation police. So you would have those who at night wanted to either go out to parties, because there was literal clubs. Nothing is new under the sun. So there was a split between the melanated population during slavery. Either you are going to shift over to the religious side and you're going to get your escape, because that's what it was for many. It was an escape from their reality. You're going to either escape through religion or you're going to escape through music. Sounds familiar? You're either going to escape through religion or you're going to escape through music. So they had clubs, which were barn houses or people's homes that turned into juke joints and party spots where people were dancing, doing the cakewalk, cutting the rug, and the DJ was the fiddler. This is real stuff. The DJ was the fiddler. Now, what would happen is sometimes, sorry, I'm drinking my tea. Sometimes the plantation police, sometimes some slaves of different plantations, and sometimes these plantations is a mile, 5 miles, 7 miles apart, okay? And so sometimes the plantation police would come and go on their little cruise, like cruising, to find out which slaves are out of position and which slaves are not where they're not supposed to be, and actually bust up the parties. Right, hence turning up at the club. You're going to escape through music or you're going to escape through religion because you're suppressed. When the soul is suppressed, if the soul doesn't have a space to release, you had the same people. You had religious folks and the worldly folks. And they would tell you, maybe I'll read it at another time. We'll come back and talk about the club. You know, you can find me at the club during slavery. I'll come back and read some of those reports for you guys at another time. But just the overview of this religious exploitation. So we know that these are two spaces that the system, right, this racist system understood could be manipulated in order to manipulate the population. Because when the fiddler come out or the DJ comes out and he plays and the slave master sitting back drinking his mint julep or drinking his whiskey on his porch, he's in amazement at how this man with this instrument can play the songs that make him dance. Or just like if you've seen the Nat Turner movie, and if you've read the Nat Turner narrative, this thought that, wow, I can use you to, because they're not listening to me. They don't want to hear it. They kind of want to hear from somebody who look like them. So if I use you to manipulate them, then I have you. These are the very same tools that are being used to manipulate the people to this day. So for us to say, forget about it, it was so long ago, but then at the same time, not realizing that the very same things that were used for generations and generations are still being used today. And what can we do about it? Well, we look at what music has done to the people, to the children, to society. And when we look at who is perpetuating these things, we have to say, wow. And why? Many people will say they did it or they're doing it because they want to get out of the position that they're in. They want to get out of abject poverty. They want to get out the hood. They want to get out the ghetto. They want to do something. So if it costs me to use my gift, talents, and abilities to be able to get out of this space, they're going to do it. And because the system knows that they're suffering economically, they know that 9 times out of 10, you're going to bite. And so it's so much there, but I'll go back to domestic abuse. There's so much there. There's so much there. It's so much there. So for those who just joined us, we're talking about, in short, slavery was a textbook case of domestic violence, unraveling systemic racism. Once again, in the space of physical, we got that. Verbal, on point. That's what happened, still happening. Emotional, economic, still happening. Religious, still happening. Reproductive, still happening. Sexual abuse, still happening. If you're looking at the rates of women, melanated women who are being ignored by doctors, and I was watching this the other day, about postpartum after giving birth, and the amount of melanated women dying through childbirth in a first world country, one has to look at this and say, what really is going on? Okay, I wanted to read in short, and I'm not going to stay all the way long because, believe it or not, I have imposed upon myself a bedtime. But hold on, and I'll be back. I wanted to share with you one of the posts that I saw that was very, very disheartening, but it was also a reality check. It was also a reality check. And it says this. Hold on. One moment. Oh, wow, I didn't know it was that. You thought something was on the surface. I'm scrolling for days. I'm like, okay, can I get to it? Oh, here we go. Wow, I didn't know it was that long ago. I thought in my mind it was like the other day. Hold on one second. So the question, and I'm going to come read the comments in a minute. Name some toxic phrases said by Black families that created toxic or confused adults. Remember, we're talking about slavery, verbal abuse, physical abuse. Indeed, indeed, indeed. I'm here. I'm working on it, y'all. I'm working on it. I miss Philippe as well. I miss Philippe as well. We gonna see right here some of the phrases. This is the people being willing to share. Some of the phrases: mama's baby, daddy's maybe. Remember what I spoke about, the relationships. This is part within the domestic abuse situation. And I neglected to share that the slave master in this situation was the father, right? That's why they call it the patriarchal system. He was supposed to be the father. He's the all-knowing. He's the one you have to appeal to if you want to get married, whatever it is that you want to do. So this masculine energy was the one supposed to govern everything down to your reproductive rights. So there's a space where you could have been promiscuous. It wasn't in certain spaces, in certain people, not all. It wasn't expected to be, because marriage was for pristine people, right? Marriage were for Europeans, not necessarily those who were enslaved. Mama's baby, daddy's maybe. At least do it for the children. Hold on. Never trust a man to take care of you. Then remember, the question was, name some toxic things that was passed down that made you possibly a toxic adult. And this never trusting a man or not being able to trust a man. Remember when his ability to protect you was stripped, when his ability to provide for you was compromised through the economics, when he was lowered in your sight, then as a defense mechanism, you had to rely on yourself and another set of people to support you. And mostly that was feminine women who oftentimes were still there, while some of the men were either on another plantation or some have just simply ran away. So this thought of never trusting a man to take care of you is something that is toxic, because in this day and age, when you try to come together, man and woman, you still have that issue. You still have that tug of war. Oh, here's one. Get out of the sun. You're already black. You don't need to get darker. This thought of, again, this verbal abuse, or you black such and such. This thought of, if you're in the house, that means you're more protected. You're closer to the European. That means you're more civilized and more human. But if you're outside in the field, then you're of lower state and you are a lowly slave. You understand what I'm saying? So that thought of not getting dark is associated with work, and work is associated with slavery, and slavery is associated with being lower than and less than. See how deep mind trip that is? And we still have that onto this day, which is called colorism. And it's not just here, it's around the world, this thought of colorism. So child A got good hair, child B got the nigger hair, can't do nothing with it. Again, the thought of good hair being associated with being mixed, that means you were violated in some sexual reproductive way, mostly with the European man and the melanated woman, because we already know the melanated man with the European woman, that equaled, strange fruit. And so this thought of being closer, or being a yellow gal, or being a fancy gal, being closer to the European, was the standard of beauty that still affects many to this day. And that's just some of Black and Ugly is another one. We just spoke about that. You don't need money. And this funny one, I read, and I'm going to find it for you. I read about the slave's relationship to money, and that was an actual thought, because oftentimes they didn't have access to money. They would be robbed of their resources and their labor. The thought was you didn't need money. And so when you look at our people's relationship to money, it is injured. And this is why you have those like Dr. Claude Anderson and Dr. Boyce Watkins out here speaking to this. But our relationship with economy, that was where we were hit majorly, because we were taught that our produce is not worth being compensated. Our labor is not worth being compensated. Someone told you, you work for me and I'll take it for free. And we, to a certain degree, still have that mentality. We'll roll up on one another. Yo, you got a business? Yo, let me get a hookup. Let me get this. Let me get that. But we will go to other people, because other people and other nationalities weren't lowered in our eyes. And so the thought was, yes, the European ice is colder. So when we talk about healing, it's not just physically, it's not just emotionally, it's actually on our very right to exist. Right? Our right as human beings to be respected for that which we produce, and vice versa. And because that has not happened, and to this day, we're still tussling with that. Every time we try to build, it comes tumbling down, and this and that. So there's so many aspects of this domestic abuse situation. This is not to say somebody just feel bad because it was domestic abuse. It is because it's not being expected for what it is. If you go to another country, you say this happening, they say, oh my goodness, let's raise some money. This is happening. You know what I mean? But when it's happening right before your eyes, and the people who you have done it to, historically, your foreparents who have suppressed, are right before you, you have to pretend like it's not that bad. Like, it's not that bad. You all right? You understand? Because then now the next thing is, well, what are you going to do about it? You don't need no business. Go find a job and work. Somebody put that. You don't need no business. Because again, getting your own business is akin to running off the plantation. When our foreparents decided that they were going to run off the plantation, that was a scary endeavor. That you're going to run off this plantation and you're going to be out there by yourself. And how are you going to live? You had free Negroes at the time, or free Blacks, who were free but did not have access to proper jobs. And so in some spaces, you would have the slave plantation who, however meager their meals and clothes were, they could expect that it was coming, would actually be doing the reverse, which is feeding those who ran off the plantation. And so you had this kind of like, I don't know, that one resonated with me because I remember reading that like, well, look at that, and he gonna be caught in a little bit. He'll be back with us. So anytime you try to run off the plantation and establish something for yourself, because the environment outside is very hostile, then the thought is, work a good job, collect your pension, get your retirement, and then you will be having steady income. Because it's not just about lacking the desire to do something, it's about being able to sustain it outside of you. People are scared of accountability and just being grown. Some of us seem like perpetual, but that point right there that you just made, Harold, is that was what the objective was. It was making you into a perpetual child. So the thought processes that got passed down for many from mother to father, father to son, grandparents on down was, listen, it is safer for you to be a perpetual child in this space so that you can stay alive and fed and protected. That was the thought process. And so this is why that was the breaking. This is why you call it the breaking of the slave. All of these things was to get you to perpetually look at the system, perpetually look at those who were over you for all of your needs. So anything that you wanted, there's no autonomy in that thought process. So I'm reading from some of the toxic things that they said their parents said to them. This is 2018. Stop crying like a bee. There's so much there in that one. I'm gonna have to come back for that one. There's so much there. I'm not gonna be. Oh, this is another one. You have to be the man of the house now. You have to be the man of the house now. This is speaking to the masculine principle not being there, stripped of his responsibility, making into a perpetual child, only there to plant the seed and thereafter, not really actively engaged or able to govern and be the father. And so if something happens to him, he's not there, then they put that responsibility of manhood on the child, on the 10-year-old, on the 5-year-old, on the 13-year-old boy. And now he doesn't have an example. He was never brought up. He was never learning. So you have these fatherless sons trying to become men. And generation it happened and generation it happened. And so they lost touch with what it meant to be a man. And so many men make it up as they go, right? There's so much more. There's so much more. But that was my illustration of how something so long ago is still very real and present because we passed it down through the ages and through time. And now it has arrived with us here in 2018. And at least in this post, I can say that it was identified as being toxic, which is a good thing. So we're going to come back another time and speak about the cycle of abuse. I'll just read this little short part right here. Domestic violence often occurs when the abuser believes that abuse is an entitlement, acceptable, justified, or unlikely to be reported. Let me read that again, because that's all of what was going on in the minds. They were the system. They were the law. So who are you going to tell? Where are you going to run? I'm justified. I own you. You're my property. I can belittle you. I can do whatever I want to you. Entitled and acceptable. And all of these things were happening during the time of slavery. I'll read that sentence again. Domestic violence often occurs when the abuser believes that abuse is an entitlement, acceptable, justified, or unlikely to be reported. It may produce an intergenerational. Let me read this again, because again, when speaking about slavery, it's all your fault, it's all your fault. But in domestic abuse, you identify the perpetrator. In slavery, you blame it on the slave. Domestic violence often occurs when the abuser believes that abuse is an entitlement, acceptable, justified, or unlikely to be reported. It may produce an intergenerational cycle of abuse in children and other family members who may feel that such violence is acceptable or condoned. Many people do not recognize themselves as abusers or victims because they may consider their experiences as family conflicts that got out of control. For instance, the slave master beat you with whips, he beat you with cat o' nine tails, he beat you with all these things. So the abused internalize it, they turn around and beat their children with all manner of things. In 2018, if I ask everybody who was here, who will come here, who you may encounter, what are some of the things that you were beaten with? I've seen people ask this question and I sit in amazement. It's laughed at, it's normalized. It's even gone to say, oh, that was it, an extension cord? That's nothing. You know, the person tried to beat me, the mother or the father tried to beat you with a machete or a bottle, and these are the things, this is the abuse that is internalized. And then the person not even realizing that you are actually an abuser. Cultural acceptance, I just spoke about that. Lack of financial resources, fear, shame, or to protect children. I'll read that again because I think I skipped over something. I actually did. Sorry, let me go back. Awareness, perception, definition, and documentation of domestic violence differs widely from country to country. Domestic violence often happens in the context of forced or child marriage. In abusive relationships, there may be a cycle of abuse during which tensions rise and act of violence is committed. And this is usually what was the thing going on. They would sit and watch Master to see what was going on. If Master was in a good mood, if Master was in a bad mood, should I go over there and ask him? Should I ask, I'm not sure we should go over there. And because if he's violent at that space and time, then he's going to rise up and do something to you. And so this thought of the abuser now becoming this codependent, which is what happens, or the abuser themselves to, have this type of walking on eggshell type of behavior to see whether or not, now is a good time. So I'll read that again. In abusive relationships, there may be a cycle of abuse during which tensions rise and in an act of violence is committed, followed by a period of reconciliation and calm. Victims of domestic violence may be trapped in domestic violence situation, trapped on plantations. You can't run away. Remember, my case here is that that slavery was domestic violence. And it is textbook definition of domestic violence. You could take every single one of these criteria and you will be looking at slavery by another name. Victims of domestic violence may be trapped in domestic violence situations through isolation, power and control, traumatic bonding to the abuser. And that's the book I spoke about. Patrick Carnes, I believe his name. We'll talk about that book next time. Trauma bonding. Cultural acceptance, lack of financial resources, fear, shame, or to protect children. Again, in the case of incidents in the life of the slave girl, her grandmother told her, you can't run away. You have to suffer with your children. You had to protect them. So that thought of the feminine principle not being able to run off and having to sit there and endure, that was a thought. Again, it's within domestic violence, and that also was a thought within slavery. The woman would be shamed. The man was encouraged in some spaces, go ahead and run off, but the woman would be shamed and castigated if she ran off and left her children unprotected. It says, as a result of abuse, victims may experience physical disabilities, dysregulated aggression, angry Black woman syndrome, angry Black man syndrome, all of these thoughts. It says dysregulated aggression, chronic health problems, mental illness, limited finances, and poor ability to create healthy relationships. That's a whole show all to itself. I'll just read that one more time. I'm not going to keep that too long tonight. As a result of abuse, victims may experience physical disabilities, dysregulated aggression. They call it dysregulated. If it's someone else, you say you're angry, you're this, you're that. But in this context, it's dysregulated. Chronic health problems, mental illness, limited finances, and poor ability to create healthy relationships. This is describing someone or a group of people who have experienced domestic violence. Victims may experience severe psychological disorders, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. Children who live in households with violence often show psychological problems from an early age, such as avoidance, hypervigilance to threats, and dysregulated aggression, which may contribute to vicarious traumatization. That was a lot, I would say. That was a mouthful. Each and every one of those could be breaking down into little parts. But because it's just an overview and it's my welcome back video, just know we're going to have a lot of stuff to talk about because they did the work for you, right? The work is done. The outline is there. The studies are done. And so we don't have to look for validation because somebody's telling you that this isn't you, slavery is you, and that's a different category. And domestic violence is the purple ribbon in October, right? And because somebody is saying that, you're like, oh, well, I'm not being validated, but this is a cause. Domestic violence is real. Let me just say this, in whatever context it occurs in. It's wrong in whatever context it occurs in. In this situation, I am using what is already here and provided for us to show us that what we're experiencing and seeing within our communities is not an anomaly, it is a result of being exploited and abused for centuries. And that expectation of being challenged in your finances, physically, socially, economically, is what is going to be the outcome of what you have endured as a people, what we have endured as a people. And hopefully that was beneficial to someone somewhere. Some will say, let me see here. Childbearing and slave beatings are different. One is love-driven, the other hate-driven. I was speaking to child beatings that exceed, that mirror slave beatings. There's correction and then there's abuse, right? There's correction and then there's abuse. The level of which we have, as a people, have learned to correct mirrors the abuse that the slave master would go to correct. So when you correct in love, you're not going to go to the degree where you maim, where you do excessive harm to the person in which you love. But the slave master, in some spaces, would go beyond to control the individual, right? And so we could come back and definitely talk more about that. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. This is, I feel like, welcome back, Carter. I will be breaking it up, though, because I know sometimes speaking about slavery all the time could get people down. So I will be coming and speaking about current events and looking at some of the things that we're identifying within current events. For instance, right now we see in current events the Kevin Hart and the Oscars. Now, if I can remember, this is just quickly, and then I'll let everybody go. A few years ago, there was a whole hashtag Oscar so white conversation. If it was 2 or 3 years ago, where this conversation that the Oscars were not diversified and melanated people were not there, and you need to appreciate us. Remember, well, I didn't get to that yet, but in trauma bonding, which was spoken about in domestic violence, is this need to be accepted. And I do have a video on that. I think I'll share the video in the link. It's an older video, but it's a video about the need of melanated people to be accepted, right? So we had that whole, accept me, upset me thing. And then in today's space and time, they elect, what's his name again? Kevin Hart to do this hosting thingy. No, needless to say, something arises now where he's reminded that, hey, we're allowing you into this space. And so he's given an ultimatum. We dug up some stuff on you. Either you're going to apologize or else. And he takes the position to say, you know what? I already said what I need to say. I'm not going to apologize. So we see that power dynamic still existing. We see that, hey, son, son, I want to talk to you, son. I need you to such and such. We see that existing. And now it's just to look out and see how it plays out after someone says no. Because in this system, when you are allowed to go into certain places, when you're allowed to climb ladders, when you're allowed to go to do certain things and you say no, when we talk about, if we put it in the context of domestic violence, you're going to get some pushback on that, because there's oftentimes, you're not allowed to have your own voice. You're not allowed to go off script, essentially. So just look out for that. I don't want to call nothing down on anybody, but once I saw it, I know he's probably fully aware of the implications of what the choice that he made. But then we are going to just see how it unfolds to see whether or not we're still within the same system that created this environment to begin with. So with that said, I will be talking about current events to the best of my ability and interweaving it into this study here. Slavery was a textbook case of domestic violence, unraveling systemic racism. Thank everybody for tuning in. Solonomics 101. Emunah Israel. Everybody have a blessed night. I'm going to put the link in the box. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. And I'm going to put the link in the box. I'm going to go try to find that old video. All right? One. Uh-oh. YouTube don't want me to go. All right, everybody.